everyone. Welcome to AJIL Explainers, a series that my co-editor-in-chief Ingrid Brunk and I are running to provide expert information and commentary on international law during Trump 2.0. This episode features John Knotts and Dan Vodansky on international environmental law. John is a professor at Wake Forest Law School and Dan at Arizona State University. Both are on the AJIL board and with Lavanya Rajamani have written an essay forthcoming in the October 2025 issue of the journal on which this discussion is based. So John and Dan, thank you very much for being here and sharing your expertise with all of us and our viewers. And let's just start by asking you, what has defined U.S. practice on international environmental law during the first several months of the second Trump administration?
Well, I guess I can start and Dan can weigh in. I think a general hostility to many aspects of international environmental cooperation, and where there's not been hostility, I think there's been a general withdrawal of cooperation.
Yeah, and I would just add that it's not only withdrawing, but actually in some cases going on the offensive, trying to influence the policies internationally of other countries.
Well, maybe we should start with Paris, the Paris Agreement, since that's first in I think many viewers' minds. Where do things stand with Paris and the UN Framework Convention more broadly?
So President Trump signed an executive order directing the U.S., I think, ambassador to the UN to submit our notice of withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was negotiated and then adopted in 2015. We became a party in 2016 under President Obama. President Trump in his first term withdrew, but then President Biden rejoined the convention on his first day in office in 2021. So now we're out again. Under the terms of the Paris Agreement, countries can withdraw by giving notice, but the withdrawal becomes effective a year after it's submitted. The U.S. withdrawal purported to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Agreement immediately. But as a matter of international law, the U.S. is still bound by the Paris Agreement for the year after the notice was submitted, which I think was in the end of January 2025. So we're still a party until 2026. Now, that means we're still bound by the obligations of the Paris Agreement internationally, even though the Trump administration said we would be withdrawing immediately. I don't think there's any real chance that we're going to be violating the Paris Agreement during in the next 4 months, because really the two obligations that applied to the U.S., namely to submit a nationally determined contribution and to submit a biennial transparency report. Biden administration did that before they left office. So there's, I think, virtually zero chance we would be in violation of our obligations. But technically, we're still party to it until January. Now, you mentioned the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We're still a party to that. There's been quite a lot of chatter recently that the U.S. may withdraw from the Framework Convention on Climate Change as well. That would be an even more drastic action. The Framework Convention was negotiated during the Bush administration back in 1991, 1992. It was approved by the Senate by a voice vote. It had broad bipartisan support. We were one of the very first countries to join it. If we were to withdraw from the Framework Convention, that would be a much more complete withdrawal of the U.S. from the international climate change arena.
In the first Trump administration, obviously he withdrew from Paris and stayed in the UN Framework Convention. What do you think? What's the thinking? I mean, if there's just this broad scale hostility toward measures relating to climate change, why stay in the UN Framework Convention at all? What do you think the Trump administration is trying to achieve by keeping one foot in?
Well, I think it's quite likely that they actually won't keep one foot in. I think it's from what I've heard, I get calls from reporters from time to time asking about the process, whether it's within the president's authority, what the international law says about it. So I think seems to be, I would infer from that there's quite a lot of discussion within the administration about withdrawing from the Framework Convention. They haven't done so yet. Framework Convention allows us to participate in the international arena. It did have broad bipartisan support. So I don't know how they're going to come out, but I would not be surprised in the least that they would withdraw from that because they have a general hostility to international and national policy to deal with the climate change problem.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you for that overview, Dan. And so, John, maybe we could ask you to tell us a little bit about other areas of international environmental cooperation. Is the Trump administration similarly withdrawing from other international environmental agreements?
Well, the good news is no. The not so good news is the answer really may just be not yet. In addition to the executive order that Dan already described, which directed the United States to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, in February, President Trump issued a much broader executive order that directs the Secretary of State to review all conventions and treaties to which the United States is a party. That's not just environmental agreements. This is going to come up in other contexts in this series, I imagine. But certainly it includes international environmental agreements. And there are a number to which the United States has been a party for a long time that might be reviewed or that will be reviewed, and U.S. participation could be at risk as a result. That includes such things as the Montreal Protocol on the ozone layer, the Minamata Mercury Convention, the London Dumping Convention, and kind of on and on. It may be relevant that, at least as of the moment, the United States has continued to participate in the negotiation of a legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. I don't know how actively it's participating, but it hasn't withdrawn from its participation. But Monica, I want to emphasize that whether the U.S. is a party or not is really only one measure of how it cooperates in these areas. And so within the legal frameworks that these MEAs, these multilateral environmental agreements, set up, there are some clear signs that the Trump administration is withdrawing from cooperation in some pretty major ways. If I could just briefly describe, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity. The United States has never actually been party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, but it's participated pretty actively, including in the efforts by the parties to the convention to set targets, non-binding targets, to try and improve international conservation. One of the most important ones that was set just in 2022 was to try to protect 30% of the entire world, set aside 30% for protection for conservation purposes. Under the Biden administration, the U.S. strongly supported that. On his first day in office, that Biden executive order, was one of the ones that Trump withdrew. And in fact, if you look at what his administration is actually doing, rather than setting aside more areas as protected, they're actually trying to open up existing areas within the United States for logging, mining, and so forth. So there's virtually no chance, if those policies continue, that the United States would be able to meet or even be interested in meeting this goal.
So if I could just add a couple points to what John just said. So it's first of all, in terms of the international environmental agreements, as John mentioned, they're reviewing all of those, and my understanding is they're reviewing those sort of in terms of whether it furthers President Trump's America First agenda. So each one is being reviewed in terms of what are any benefits to the U.S. of being a party to it, and what are the costs to the U.S. And so I think it's quite likely that at least the U.S. will pull out of at least some of those agreements. An agreement like the ozone agreement, the Montreal Protocol, does have quite a lot of industry support. So I think that would be one that perhaps will be less likely. We'll be finding out probably in the next several months which ones we stay in and which ones we leave. And it's not just also agreements, it's also institutions. So whether we continue to participate in the UN Environment Program, for example, is also, I think, an open question. Whether we're going to send a delegation to the UN Environment Assembly meeting, which is scheduled in December, I think that has not been decided yet. So it's quite a broad withdrawal potentially from not just the climate change agreement, but also from other international environmental regimes.
Okay, thank you.
Dan,
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Ingrid.
I was going to ask a quick follow-up. I think that's really helpful. I was wondering if either of you have seen any more that would reveal, when we're thinking about U.S. interests, what exactly is getting factored into that? I mean, I think the most obvious one that occurs to most people is that these programs at some level are expensive, or they are costly to the US economy, or they involve aid to international organizations. So they're costly in that sense. But do you have any more vision of what the strategy is when the Trump administration is evaluating which ones are in the American interest and which ones aren't? Or is that just a black box at this point?
I think it's something of a black box. I think to the extent some of the an agreement like the Montreal Protocol actually was strongly supported by U.S. industry, it would be an argument that it is serving our interests. U.S. The Montreal Protocol requires moving away from ozone depleting substances and substituting non-ozone depleting substances for them. And American industry has been quite good at developing substitutes for ozone depleting substances. So the US in some ways has it's benefited not just environmentally, obviously, but it also has economic benefits from the Montreal Protocol in terms of providing manufacturing substitutes for ozone depleting substances. So that would be an example of where I think the Trump administration might be more likely to continue supporting that agreement because it I don't know how the review will come out, but I think it's not impossible to imagine that it would come out saying that the Montreal Protocol is in the U.S. interest under President Trump's agenda.
So the only thing I would add to that is I think that the most obvious places would be where the US is actually writing a check. So the US has already indicated that it's rescinding its pledge of $4 billion to the Green Climate Fund that was made under previous administrations. I don't know, Dan, what you think, but I would be nervous about any other commitments the US has made to any kind of international environmental funds or cooperation. Those seem like obvious places that this administration would look to cut.
Yeah, it's also cut back or eliminated its funding for climate change. It's quite a broad effort involving not just withdrawing from treaties, but also dismantling the offices within the State Department and other agencies, departments that address issues like climate change. So the special presidential envoy on climate change, that office was eliminated. The other office within the Oceans, Environment, and Sciences Bureau of the State Department, the office that deals with climate change, that was eliminated. Everybody's gone from that. There's been, I think, very substantial cutbacks in what funding is being given to NOAA, which does a lot of the scientific research related to climate change. So it's not simply a matter of withdrawing from treaties that we could maybe later join again. It's also a matter of eliminating the sort of expertise in the US government that's been working on this issue for the last several decades.
And just given how extensively the United States has actually provided funding and expertise and itself engaged with these regimes historically, how much of a gap do you think that these moves are going to create, not just in what the US does, but in sort of like the global architecture more generally? And you could ask the question both in terms of like what trends do you think, what are the ripple effects for others? Are they going to engage in, for example, copycat behavior, seeing that the United States is significantly drawing down on its environmental commitments and therefore finding reason to do the same? But also just in terms of the fact that without the degree of expertise and capacity and resources and commitments to these regimes, that they simply will need to find other sources of funding and resources and expertise if they're going to continue doing much more of their mission. And I guess I'm just wondering what you think those effects will be more broadly beyond just what the United States itself is doing.
Well, I'll start, I guess, and I'll focus on the effects of the cuts on, let's say, civil society organizations, nonprofit organizations. In many places, that's simply been devastating. So, as has been extensively documented, USAID has just been gutted. And a lot of the money that flowed through USAID went for programs in the environmental space, such as conservation programs. So if you were a recipient of one of those programs, then it's quite likely that the program you were operating with that funding is now stopped. It's just gone. Some people have been able to scramble for replacement funds, but there's just not enough other funding sources out there to kind of soak all of that up. So that does have and will have a ripple effect for years, because as Dan said, with respect to the US government, the loss of that expertise, when it's gone, it takes a long time to rebuild. And you can kind of extend that out through the civil society space, where a lot of the people who were working in that space will now not be able easily to continue to work there. But I'll let Dan tackle the question about how will this affect other states.
So I think, I mean, amplifying the problems raised by what the U.S. is doing, the international environment generally, or the political environment internationally, globally, is not one that's very positive right now. The European Union is having to now invest much more substantially in military spending, so they have less money to devote to environmental issues. It's not just the US that's showing some hostility to multilateral issues. Other countries, some of them have similar trends. So we're dealing with a very challenging international environment for support for these kinds of initiatives. I think that it's really not clear which other countries would step up to sort of play the role that the U.S. has played in developing many of these regimes over the years. U.S. is often criticized for not taking more for some of its environmental positions, but I think the U.S. really, over the years, has been instrumental in developing a lot of these regimes. It plays sort of a brokering role, or a role trying to figure out how to get different countries together to get an agreement. And so I think it's had shown a lot of leadership over the years in the climate change regime, but in other regimes as well. So who would replace the US in that respect, I think is not so easy to see. In the plastics negotiation, for example, there's huge splits between different groups. And so the question is how to get an agreement. Some kind of compromises will be needed to try to come up with a document that countries can support, and who's going to try to play that role. I don't think there's really anyone right now in the plastics regime that's doing that, and that was traditionally something the US, if it was more engaged, might have done. But we're still participating in that negotiation, but we're not playing that kind of role anymore. So I think it's whether other countries copy the U.S., I think that's an open question. So in the first term, when President Trump's first term, when he withdrew from the Paris Agreement, I think there was fear that others might copy that and withdraw as well, but that didn't happen. The regime sort of went along and actually developed the Paris rulebook during that time period. The U.S. actually, during Trump 1, was really quite different than it's been in Trump 2, because even though we said we were withdrawing from Paris, a lot of the same people were involved. The U.S. still played, I think, a positive role in the international negotiations, whereas now we're not even going to the meetings. And not only are we not participating, but we're also have threatened retaliation against other countries if they support the International Maritime Organization's strategy to deal with greenhouse gas emissions from vessels. The IMO is considering adopting a strategy that would involve a fee on greenhouse gas emissions from vessels to try to deal with that sector of the economy. And that would have impacts on the US, because shipping is very international. And so even though the US wouldn't be party to that, it would be affected by that. And the Trump administration is pushing back, I don't know how aggressively, but they've certainly issued statements that countries that support the IMO strategy would face potential US retaliation.
Building on this set of questions about the world's reaction to Trump 2.0 and in the environmental space. One of the points that your essay makes, and I highly recommend the essay to anyone watching the webinar. It's an excellent essay. One of the points you make is that Trump is making the United States into an unreliable treaty partner. I'm curious how much effect that might have. Assume that's true. The world views the United States as an unreliable treaty partner. It seems to me one of the calculuses of the Trump 2.0 is that they really don't care whether the world sees us as an unreliable treaty partner, and that a lot of things that IR theorists have said for a long time about how there's going to be all these costs if you're not a reliable treaty partner, that I don't think the administration agrees with that calculus. And I'm just, since you raised it in your essay, I'm curious how you see that playing out in this space. So if in 5 years the United States comes back and wants to negotiate an environmental treaty, or will it be more costly for us to do so? So how exactly is the idea that the United States is not going to be a reliable treaty partner? What impact do you see that having going forward?
So this has been an issue for a while. This predates the Trump administration. The world renegotiated the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in order to amend it in this way that the US could support. And the US got what it wanted in that negotiation, but still has not been able to join the Law of the Sea Convention because getting Senate advice and consent, as you know, requires 2/3 majority, and that's been impossible to do, even though I think probably every administration until Trump has actually supported, both Republican and Democrat have supported US ratification of that instrument. So this has been an issue for a while. Will other countries think that they should make concessions to try to get the US to participate if it's unclear whether the US will participate, even if those concessions are given? So I think now with the back and forth on climate change and probably on other issues as well, countries are going to be concerned, I think much more concerned, that even when the US agrees, the US agreement might not last beyond whatever administration joins a treaty. So I think this is a big problem. The fact, though, is that most of the countries, the US is key player. And so even if countries are suspicious as to whether the US will maintain its treaty commitments long term, I think it's unlikely they will stop playing ball with the US. I think the desire to get the US on board is sufficiently great that they will, even though they are maybe skeptical as to the long-term commitments of the US, they'll still probably continue to negotiate with the US in a similar fashion. That's what I've observed thus far, at least.
The only thing I would say that maybe, I mean, I agree with all of that. The only thing I think that in some ways is different this time is that the US has often not joined treaties, but nevertheless, in the environmental space, but nevertheless kind of supported the overall object and purpose. So for example, with the respect to the Law of the Sea Convention, as we all know, the US has basically treated its provisions as generally reflective of customary international law and tried to act in accordance with that, even though it's not a party to the treaty. With the Convention on Biological Diversity, it's one of the very few countries that's not a party, but it participates actively and so forth. I do think the degree to which the Trump administration is kind of breaking new ground in a way is in its overt hostility to some of the goals of these regimes, especially the climate regime. And I think it's very hard to predict what's going to happen there because we don't have a lot of examples of that in the environmental space. In some ways, it reminds me of this Bush Jr. opposition to the Rome Statute in the International Criminal Court, where it wasn't just that we're not going to cooperate, we're going to actively try to undermine it. And that, I think, is obviously extremely worrying. It's one thing to step out of the agreement and then to step back into it when a new administration comes in. But if you're actively trying to destroy or at least do what you can to damage the international framework, that can create damage that's a lot harder to rectify for a later administration.
And I would just add one more point, which is I think during Trump 1, when the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement, I think a lot of countries regarded it as maybe an anomaly that Trump one would be followed by an administration that would rejoin Paris, and over the longer term, the U.S. would stay part of the UN climate regime. But now that we have a repetition of this with Trump 2, I think the effect of the withdrawal is more serious, because even if people thought, other countries thought, maybe a new administration would rejoin, there's the fact that things go back and forth so much in the US means the new administration rejoining, there'd be probably little confidence that that would continue uh, longer term. So I think each time this is repeated, it makes the confidence of other countries in the durability of commitments by the US, it further undermines that.
Maybe we could just switch gears a little here, but in doing so, I also just want to ask a broader question that picks up on some of the themes that I think are emerging from the webinar. So the way to switch gears is to ask you, John, I'd like you to ask you a little bit about the relationship between human rights law and environmental law, and the ways in which international human rights law has sort of pushed the envelope on state obligations relating to the environment in ways that states have not themselves collectively adopted through these sort of like consensual mechanisms that exist under the environmental law treaties. And part of the reason I'm framing it like that is because this sort of gets at the broader like trend that I want to ask about, which is it seems like for some time, the United States, and correct me if I'm wrong, the United States' position in relation to certainly the climate regime, but maybe international environmental law more generally, has been a commitment, maybe at the elite level and at the level of policy governance, foreign policy governance, like in the State Department and what some refer to as the blob, but not one that has been really deeply entrenched within the US polity and reflected sort of like a democratic support for. And I wonder whether what we're seeing is some kind of backlash against, I mean, we are obviously seeing a backlash more generally, but specifically in this context, whether what we're seeing is a backlash against sort of regulation at the international level through mechanisms that are not entirely consensual, even under international law, but certainly not supported and sustained by the American public more generally, and whether there are lessons to be learned from that dynamic, if it is in fact the dynamic that is sort of playing out right now.
Well, that's a big topic. Just to kind of elaborate a little bit more on what you said, I think the field of human rights and the environment has been a particularly vibrant one for the last decade or two. There are increasing efforts all over the world to bring human rights to bear on environmental issues, certainly including climate issues. Those efforts often include litigation. The most recent kind of well-known example, I guess, is the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice just this last summer, which was actually requested, of course, by the General Assembly, but in the course of which the ICJ said not only that human rights law is relevant to climate protection, but that states have obligations to protect the climate under human rights law, and even recognize the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as one that's essentially part of human rights law. That's going to further supercharge efforts to bring cases against specific states, against specific actors at the national level, the international level, and so forth. I do think that is in reaction to what you might think of as the kind of international environmental superstructure, but I don't know that I would agree with you that it's a reaction that's kind of based on a feeling that that superstructure is out of touch with, well, how do I want to put this? I think the problem is essentially that many people see that superstructure as being ineffective. So we've been having climate talks now for decades, and yet what real concrete progress do most people think who are following this issue think has been made in that area? Relying on states and governments to essentially regulate themselves has turned out not to be that effective, at least in the eyes of many people. So they are increasingly going to court to try to get courts to order states or governments to do what they should be doing. Now, that has all kinds of limitations. For one thing, many of the biggest emitters are simply going to ignore, or not, their courts won't be open to those kinds of cases to begin with. And if they did issue somehow a decision, they're going to pretty much ignore it. But nevertheless, I think it is an expression of the dissatisfaction that many people feel with kind of relying on their states and what you call the blob to kind of just work out these issues for them. So for me, I agree with a lot of what you said, but I think I would almost reverse it. It's that it's not so much that the blob is ahead of the population generally on this, it's behind it. Most people would like there to be more effective environmental protections. They don't want to have to spend a lot of money or give up their way of life to get there, but at the same time, they would like to not have to worry about the climate getting so warm by the time their children are their age that they're not going to be able to kind of raise their own kids in the parts of the world that they're like to raise their kids and so forth. So having said all of that, what's Trump 2.0 doing with respect to that? To a large degree, I think here there's not that much effect yet that I can tell. The Trump administration hasn't really targeted the connection between human rights and the environment, except insofar as that it's targeted what it thinks of as DEI programs. That is the idea of discrimination or disproportionate effect of environmental harm on members of racial or other minorities or class-based, lower income communities. And there, it simply, again, ended all of the programs that previous administrations had put in place. So it closed the Environmental Justice Office within the Department of Justice and EPA almost immediately after taking office. And that's certainly an important part of the environmental justice movement is certainly an important part of this kind of intersection of human rights and the environment, even though it's not the only part of it.
So if I could just
In
add,
the
if part of your question, Monica, is about whether some of what the Trump 2.0 is doing is a reaction to non-consensual aspects of international environmental law, imposition of rules on the U.S. from the outside. I don't think that explains very much because the hostility has been greatest on the climate change issue, and the climate change regime is really extremely deferential to states. The basis for the Paris Agreement is that each country nationally determines what it's going to do to reduce its emissions. It doesn't impose any requirements. It gives countries complete flexibility or virtually complete flexibility in fashioning its climate change policy. So the notion that Trump administration U.S. is withdrawing from Paris because it wants to get out from under the yoke of some international groups that are trying to force the U.S. to change. I think that's really just a complete mischaracterization of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was written in reaction to the Kyoto Protocol, which would have imposed binding emission limitations on the U.S., but Paris was a reaction to that and was designed to give countries flexibility and defer to their decisions about what they wanted to do to deal with the climate change issue. So I don't think that's really a significant factor. Now, if international courts started trying to tell the U.S. that they had to change their climate policy because of both environmental norms and because of human rights norms, I think then we would see probably complete pushback by the Trump administration against that. But that's just speculating into the future.
Well, Dan, can I just push you on this? Listen, I'm not actually pressing this particular view. I'm actually like I'm not sure about it. It's something that I sometimes hear, and I'm interested in calling out yours. So I think that what you say makes sense. One response to that might be, and I'd just be curious in hearing your reaction, is yeah, the Paris Agreement on its own terms actually is quite limited in what it requires states to do beyond what they themselves have consented to. In fact, by its very terms, it is limited to exactly what they're willing to consent to. But the impression of the Paris Agreement and the sort of culture of the Paris Agreement and the conferences that the Paris Agreement generates and sort of all of that is much larger than the limited terms of the text that basically no one actually reads, other than the people who are specifically working in this area. And I guess I'm just wondering whether that is actually the sort of social and political context of a push for more international action is the thing against which we are seeing the reaction, and that there is not enough. Although there is, I take John's point too. The argument would go, although there are certainly members of the American public who want much more protections for the environment, there are also certainly members of the American public who view the environment as a secondary or tertiary concern. And when they see so much attention focused on it, they also sort of wonder why that's the thing that's getting attention. So I'm just wondering if you could play out a little bit more, like how the political economy of the United States relates to what the Trump administration is doing on the international plane, and how the two sort of like intersect. And not to say that the story I'm telling is like the most accurate version of it, but one could tell a story along these lines. And it's certainly the story I think that the Trump administration and supporters would like to tell along the you know the international environmental law has sort of is requiring too much of the United States, and that there's too much pressure on the United States to do things that other states won't do, and so on and so forth. You know the rhetoric, you know how it goes. And so what is the response to that?
Well, I think the response is, I think the situation is much simpler. The UN climate change regime, yes, it is intended, the purpose of it is to try to get countries to address the climate change issue by reducing emissions and taking measures to adapt to climate change. So that is the function of the UN climate change regime, both the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement. If you are in an administration, or if it's an administration that doesn't believe climate change is real, that thinks that climate change, taking action on climate change would be detrimental to US fossil fuel interests and energy sector, uh, energy costs and so forth, yes, you would want to oppose the climate change regime, because the climate change regime is pushing in a direction that the Trump administration doesn't support. I don't think it's really a function of it's exercising too much power, is restricting US sovereignty. The policy of the climate change regime is to encourage countries to reduce their emissions and address climate change. The Trump administration is trying to dismantle US policy to deal with climate change. So those are fundamentally opposed. And so it's not surprising then that they would be hostile to the UN climate change regime, because it's pushing in the exact opposite direction as from what the Trump administration would like to move.
I agree with all of that, but I do think, Monica, you're right that there's something else going on too. I think there's two things that kind of overlap with respect to the climate regime in particular. The other thing I want to kind of underline that Monica said, though, that I think is also going on, is that I think for a long time there's been a real disconnect between the perception of what international environmental law requires the US to do versus the reality of what international environmental law requires the US to do. And this is not limited just to international environmental law, although I think it's has particularly deep roots there on the right that predate Trump. So Dan and I have both seen many examples of situations which people make statements about what an international environmental regime requires the US to do that are simply not the case. Going all the way back to the 1992 Rio conference and the adoption of something called Agenda 21. Agenda 21 is completely non-binding, but for a long time, commentators like Glenn Beck tried to turn it into this kind of like international takeover of the world, and kind of this secret plan that the UN had to essentially regulate every aspect of Americans' lives. You know, again, you look more closely at these regimes, and as Dan has explained with respect to climate, it's very similar in respect to many other regimes. The US has had a huge amount of influence in how these regimes are created, and has created them in ways that don't really require us to do things we aren't prepared and happy to do, or at least historically have been happy to do. And if we don't like doing them, there's ways for us to basically change our behavior without violating the regimes. But the perception on the right is quite different from that. And so I do think a lot of what's going on here is that the Trump administration is basically responding to the perception, either because they really have convinced themselves that's the truth, which would require a pretty high degree of just ignorance of the actual facts on their part, but that could well be the case, or because they simply think it makes political sense for their own purposes to treat the myth as the fact. But I do think that distinction is one that's causing a lot of the problems in this area. But I also agree with what Dan said, that with respect to climate in particular, it kind of overlaps and therefore reinforces their attitude towards that regime and makes it all the more hostile.
It's similar to the issue of foreign aid, where if you ask people how much the US is giving in foreign aid, the numbers and polls are wildly higher than what we actually give. So that there's this perception that we're giving huge amounts of money to other countries or spending huge amounts of money, maybe even on climate change, when in fact the reality is we're actually not contributing nearly that much. So I think there's often a very strong mischaracterizations of treaties or U.S. Things that U.S. is obliged to do, and there's also widespread public uh, misperception as to those facts.
Building on a listener question, we know kind of famously with respect to Kyoto that states meaning U.S. states and sub-state groups kind of stepped in the local and state level and pushed compliance and pushed change from the ground up. How do you see the prospects for that in Trump 2.0? And in particular, is the dismantling of the federal bureaucracy and sort of the climate superstructure so so effective that it really makes state action much more difficult than it used to be? Or are the options available to U.S. states like California and Massachusetts, do those remain pretty much as they've been, or has that landscape really changed?
So there still is quite an active effort by groups in the U.S. that support stronger climate policies to work internationally to try to tell the world that actually, even though the U.S. federal government has pulled out of the Paris Agreement and is hostile to the UN climate regime, there's still a lot of things going on in the U.S. at the state level. And I think the states that are taking action on climate change represent, roughly half of or more of the U.S. economy, the U.S. population. So there's a pretty active effort. There was during Trump 1, the We're Still In movement, and that has continued now in Trump 2.0. I think, though, just as the Trump administration is more aggressive, I think, in opposing climate policies internationally, it's also been tougher in terms of trying to limit what the states can do to deal with climate change. So I think they're more actively challenging climate policies of states like California. So the ability of states to go their own way on climate policy, I think is, I'm not an expert on US domestic law, but my understanding is more in question now than it was previously.
If I could just give one example of that. So under the Clean Air Act, California has the right essentially to set its own vehicle emissions standards. It's just kind of written into the act that way, but it has to get a waiver from EPA in order to do that. That has not been a problem under previous administrations, at least under the most recent Democratic administrations. I expect the Trump administration is going to fight California's effort to do that with respect to carbon dioxide emissions. So that would, again, be a concrete way of, a concrete example of the difference between saying on the one hand, well, we're not going to do anything, but you do what you want, we're just not going to help you, and actually actively trying to prevent anyone from addressing the issue, which it seems to be more where this administration currently is.
Okay, maybe one last question, because I am cognizant of time, and that is just if you could each give us your quick view on where you think international environmental law goes from here, given that the United States is doing all that it's doing to impede efforts for serious environmental regulation at the international level and, as you said, at the domestic level. So sort of what is the future trajectory in your view, if you were to sort of anticipate where it's going?
I think we both feel great, Monica. I don't know how you wouldn't get that impression from this. I mean, I'll let Dan take international environmental. I mean, he can obviously say whatever he wants. I'm kind of mixed on the long-term effects on international environmental law. I'm not too worried about the law as a legal regime. I think that will survive. My concern is more the long-term effects on the environment itself. Unlike some areas of international law, we're kind of on the clock here. It's like we're being given a time to test. And we just don't have time for this kind of back and forth, the kind of back and forth that Dan has described. With respect to climate, unless we make real progress in the next decade, we are really laying up major problems for ourselves. And you could extend that to other areas of environmental cooperation that receive less attention. International conservation is really at a crisis point now, and it gets a fraction of the attention of climate. So again, the problem to me is the long-term effects are likely to be felt for a very long time if we don't take effective action in the next 5 to 10 years in some of these areas. Some of the things we're losing are simply not going to be recoverable, at least on a kind of normal human timescale. At least that's my concern.
So I think I would agree with everything John just said. I think there's always been ebbs and flows in the development of international environmental law. There was a period of quite rapid growth in the 1970s, and then in the 80s, early 80s during the Reagan administration, not so much activity, and then picked up again in the late 80s and into the 90s with the Rio conference and the adoption of the Climate Change and Biodiversity Convention. So there's always been sort of ups and downs. I think we'll see now going forward probably a much more variable geometry of the development of international environmental law, where in regions like Europe, probably Latin America too, it's still pretty robust. There's a lot of activity in regional human rights courts on environmental issues that I think will continue. So, but I think in other areas like the US with significant withdrawal or hostility. So I think I think international environmental law will continue to develop, but it might not develop as effectively globally. Even if global rules are adopted, countries like the US will stay out of them, so they won't really be effectively global. But I guess I'm hoping at least that eventually there'll be another change and we'll see a continued progress, re-engagement. The question, as John says, is we don't have that much time. So waiting a decade or 2 decades for things to change may be too late.
Thank you both so much. Thank you for your contributions to the print issue of the American Journal of International Law on this topic. Much appreciated. Thank you for all of your work also as board members of the American Journal of International Law. And thank you as well to our audience.
Thank you,
Thank
Ingrid,
you.
and thanks for doing this series.
Yep.
Thank you everyone for joining today. We will be sharing the recording of this conversation within the next week. Full archives of AJIL and AJIL Unbound can be found on the journal's website, which is cambridge.org/AJIL. Just many thanks again to the panelists and the audience for your time today.